Everyone loves a good collapse. There's something deeply satisfying about watching the mightiest thing in the room fall over, and no thing was ever mightier, for longer, than Rome. So naturally people want the story of its fall to match. A single catastrophic afternoon, barbarians pouring over the walls, an emperor weeping on a throne as the world ends around him. I'm sorry to report that the truth is far more embarrassing than that. Rome didn't fall. Rome slouched. It declined the way a great fortune gets squandered by successive generations of increasingly disappointing heirs. Slowly, then all at once, and mostly through a long series of decisions that each seemed reasonable to the person making them, and catastrophic to everyone who came after. Let's start with the empire at its height, because you need to appreciate how much there was to lose. At its peak, Rome ran the entire Mediterranean world. Roads, aqueducts, plumbing, law, a standing professional army, a bureaucracy, a currency everyone trusted, cities of 1 million people with functioning sanitation, a level of organized comfort that large parts of Europe would not see again for 1,000-odd years after it was gone. This was the big one, the main event of the ancient world, and the Romans, understandably, assumed it would last forever, because that is the one thing every empire in history has believed right up until the moment it stopped being true. So how do you lose something like that? Slowly and in about 6 ways at once. Start with the money. Running an empire is astonishingly expensive, and Rome's expenses kept climbing while its income didn't. The army had to be paid. The bureaucracy had to be paid. The endless frontier had to be garrisoned. And to cover it, emperors did the thing that governments in trouble always do, which is quietly ruin the currency. They kept minting coins with less and less actual silver in them, hoping nobody would notice. People noticed. Prices spiraled, trust in the money evaporated, and the economy began the slow, grim work of eating itself. There is nothing new about inflation. Rome was doing it with a hammer and a furnace. Then there's the small matter of the government being, for long stretches, a complete circus. There was a period where the throne changed hands so many times, so violently, that being made emperor was less a promotion and more a medical diagnosis with a very short prognosis. Generals murdered emperors to become emperors, and were then murdered by the next general with the same idea. The army figured out it could simply install whoever paid it the most, which is a wonderful arrangement for the army and an existential problem for everyone else. When the top job is decided by whoever is willing to stab the current occupant, you do not tend to attract careful long-term planners. Eventually the empire got so unwieldy that they split it in two, an eastern half and a western half, on the sensible-sounding theory that 2 administrators could manage the sprawl better than one. And in fairness, it worked, for one of them. The eastern half, wealthier and better defended, would carry on for another 1,000 years. The western half, the one with Rome actually in it, got the worse end of the deal. The longer borders, the thinner treasury, and the growing sense that the people in charge were managing a decline rather than running an empire. And all of this, the money problems, the political knife fights, the administrative overstretch, was happening while pressure built on the borders. For centuries, Rome had handled the peoples beyond its frontier the way it handled everything, with a mixture of war, bribery, and absorbing them into the machine. But that system depended on Rome being strong enough to enforce the terms. As the center weakened, the arrangement frayed. Various groups, pushed by their own crises further east, started moving into Roman territory, sometimes as invaders, but very often as desperate people looking for somewhere safer to live. And Rome, catastrophically, kept mishandling them, alternately fighting them, recruiting them into its own armies, betraying them, and then acting surprised when the people it had mistreated turned around and mistreated it back. Which brings us to the famous bit. In the year 410, a group led by a commander named Alaric did something that hadn't happened in some 800 years. They took the city of Rome itself and sacked it. Now, by this point, Rome wasn't even the functioning capital anymore. The administration had moved elsewhere, because nothing says confidence like the Roman government relocating out of Rome for safety. But symbolically, it was an earthquake. The eternal city, the one that sacked everyone else, had been sacked. Contemporaries wrote about it the way you'd write about the sky cracking open. It was the moment the unthinkable was revealed to be not only thinkable but, awkwardly, already done. And here's the part that punctures the drama. That wasn't the end. Rome got sacked, dusted itself off, and limped on for several more decades in an increasingly threadbare fashion. A shrinking Western empire ruled by a succession of emperors who ranged from well-meaning but powerless to actively part of the problem, most of them propped up by barbarian generals who were doing the real governing and slowly realizing they didn't strictly need the emperor at all, which is exactly how it actually ended, and it's the least cinematic finale imaginable. In the year 476, a Germanic commander named Odoacer looked at the current Western emperor, a teenager, almost comically named Romulus Augustulus, carrying the names of both Rome's founder and its first emperor like a bad omen, and simply deposed him. Didn't even bother to kill him, pensioned him off, and rather than crown a new Western emperor, Odoacer just didn't. He sent the imperial regalia east and effectively said, "We don't need a Roman emperor in the West anymore." And that was it. The Western Roman Empire ended, not with a battle or a massacre, but with a paperwork decision that a certain job was no longer necessary. The mightiest empire the Western world had known was quietly made redundant, like a department nobody wanted to admit had stopped being useful years ago. So, the number. And here I have to reframe the question, because how many died in the fall of Rome isn't quite the right thing to ask. There was no single body count, because there was no single event. What Rome offers instead is a different and stranger kind of casualty figure. The deaths were real and they were vast. The sackings, the constant civil wars, the frontier battles, the famines and breakdowns that follow when a complex society stops functioning. Across the long centuries of decline and the chaotic ones that followed, the human toll ran well into the millions. But that's not the number that haunts this one. The number that haunts this one is the drop. At its height, the city of Rome held perhaps 1 million people. Within a couple of centuries of the collapse, that same city had shrunk to a fraction of that, by some estimates as few as 20 or 30,000 souls, wandering through the ruins of monuments they could no longer build or even properly maintain, grazing livestock in the shadow of structures that must have looked like the work of gods or giants. A city that had held 1 million was reduced to a village squatting in its own colossal wreckage. That's the real casualty count of the fall of Rome. Not just the people who died, but the staggering amount of human capability that simply evaporated. The knowledge, the engineering, the scale of what people could organize and achieve, gone and not recovered for 1,000 years. And that's the quietly terrifying lesson in it. We like to imagine that progress is a ratchet, that once a civilization reaches a certain height it stays there, that things only ever get more advanced. Rome is the enormous patient counterexample sitting in the middle of history, reminding everyone who bothers to look that everything achieved can be lost, that the lights can go out, and that it doesn't take a monster or a meteor to do it. It just takes a few centuries of people making understandable decisions, each one slightly worse than the last, until one day a man in charge decides the emperor isn't needed anymore and nobody has the strength to argue. Anyway, that was Rome. All of it. I'll be here, among the ruins.